Welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, a show dedicated to podcast advertising. If you're a podcaster or an advertiser and you're wondering how you can take advantage of this rapidly growing space, you're in the right place. On the program, we'll discuss strategies and techniques to optimize your experience with podcast advertising. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood. And today on the program, it is the middle of 2021 when I am recording this episode. We just celebrated 4th of July, and I thought that it would be a terrific time to talk about mid-year predictions for podcast advertising. I know that we always like to talk about trends at the beginning of a year, and I thought this weekend, why do we do that? Why not go ahead and talk about trends in the middle of the year and go ahead and revamp your goals, think about what is going to be taking place in the last 6 months of the year. I'm really excited for the upcoming 6 months. We have Podcast Movement coming up in Nashville in August. Our entire team will be there, and I know many people in the podcast community are going to be attending as well. I think we're all really excited to be able to get back to an in-person event, and I just feel so bad that our friends in other countries aren't going to be able to join us, but we're really excited to be at Podcast Movement. So let's get into the trends and predictions that I see for the upcoming 6 months of the last part of 2021. This past week, Amazon purchased Art19, making them yet another large company to invest heavily within the podcast space. So it is certainly no secret that big business is entering this space, and it just seems that the players keep doubling down on what is happening in podcasting. Now, the value that I believe that this brings to the podcast space is obviously this level of recognition that what we are all doing is definitely of value, because it's not just a small group of people or a niche group of people that are looking at podcasting, but really these huge companies all making waves. Everyone is there trying to kind of get a play in the podcast space. Of course, Apple has been here for many years and is making a lot of changes too. What I think is the value of this, again, is that we have the attention of larger companies. And as we have the attention, that means we also have the dollars. And the way I see it, all of those dollars are going to help add to the value of the industry, because they're going to, of course, bring with them hopefully new technologies, new perspectives, and just new relationships. And all of that, I really believe, is super helpful for the industry. The other thing that I think is really interesting when we look at these bigger companies coming into the space is it really does change the ad landscape, because they're bringing in with them new tools and new technology, and maybe even not new technology, but they're bringing with them all of this knowledge that they have already within their larger organizations. So I see that as really going to increase programmatic ads within the space. So programmatic ads are essentially those pre-recorded ads that get automatically inserted into podcasts. I know that when Spotify purchased Megaphone at the end of 2020, they brought with them, I think, a staff of like 300 salespeople that are now working to sell podcast advertising at Spotify. So that's a huge influx of dollars that are going to be happening in this space, because you've got all these salespeople out there really trying to sell podcast advertising. The difference, of course, is that they are selling them programmatically. The other thing that Spotify has is they have all of this rich data that we have really needed in this space. So Spotify has this rich data. They can partner that with their sales team that they have. So there's this opportunity, I think, to really help, bring more ad dollars into the space in this programmatic way. Of course, you know, if you have listened to this podcast, that I am a huge proponent of the host-read endorsement ad. Now, what Spotify is doing with programmatic ads certainly serves a purpose and has its place, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with programmatic ads, but I do believe that there is real value in host-read endorsement ads. So my prediction is that as we see more programmatic ads enter the space, we're going to be opening the doors for other advertisers and brands to come and advertise in this space but we also are going to be increasing the value of the host read ad because we know the host read ad works super well. And it's that endorsement, it's that influencer marketing. So I do think the two pair well together. My hope and my prediction is that we will see an increase in rates for host read endorsement ads, and potentially this programmatic will then fill in the cracks and help us to grow the revenue overall as an industry. Next, I really do see that dynamic ad insertion is just going to continue to increase. If we see an increase in programmatic, of course, that has to be partnered with dynamic ad insertion. So dynamic ad insertion is that ability to electronically insert ads within podcasts. And that, again, can be a host read ad or it can be a pre-recorded announcer read ad. But it really is a very important piece in terms of growing revenue in the space, is that dynamic ad insertion technology. I do see that we are going to, as an industry, need to focus on how to make dynamic ad insertion more effective. When we think about any sort of advertising, it's all around reach and frequency. If you don't have a high enough reach, you're not going to get results. And if you don't have a high enough frequency, you're not going to get results. Now, when we look at dynamic ad insertion, what it really allows for us to do is create this great frequency, meaning the same person can hear the same ad or a similar ad for an advertiser multiple times. And we want that ad to happen because we know that if somebody is hit multiple times, they're more likely to make a buying decision. The issue with dynamic ad insertion, from my perspective, is the reach piece. So how many people are we reaching, and are we capping that reach? So if we have, the same 20 people being hit 200 times with an ad, that does not work, right? We need to make sure that we're reaching a large enough audience and giving that audience a certain number of impressions. So I do really believe that one of the challenges that we're having with dynamic ad insertion in terms of increasing performance is looking at that reach piece. Now, that's hard because not all hosting providers will allow us to see the reach of that particular ad. Again, that gets back to the technology that we always talk about. And so I would really like to see hosting providers pay closer attention to giving us that reach number so that we can then come up with a calculation to get that reach and frequency really dialed in so that we can see performance increase. But I do see that we're going to continue to increase with dynamic ad insertion. And we need to make sure that we're doing both those programmatic and those host-read ads within that dynamic ad insertion feature. I do see that, of course, we're going to have more ad tech coming into the space. I know that it is so important for us to really continue to build on the metrics. Now, I think it's very common for us to say that there aren't enough metrics in podcasting, and that's what's really holding back the results that we're trying to get in the industry in terms of advertising is better metrics. However, I would argue that our metrics have increased substantially in the last couple of years, and I know that they're just going to continue to increase. So I do believe that there is a lot of time, attention, and thought being put into the metrics and the way the whole ad processing works within podcast advertising. And my prediction is we're going to continue to see that grow. Lastly, I cannot leave out attribution. Attribution has become such a major part of podcast advertising. Now, when we're talking about attribution, we're talking about that pixel tracking that happens through companies like Podsights and Chartable and Barometric and things like that. So when we look at attribution, it has been around now for a couple of years, and it was something that was a nice to have. Definitely at the end of 2020, it was a nice to have. As we got further and further into 2021, I will say that many advertisers and agencies are requiring attribution in order to place a campaign. I think that this is so important for us to look at because not all hosting providers are set up to accept attribution, or they're not set up to accept attribution, perhaps for dynamically inserted ads. So we have companies like Anchor. I know Simplecast is working on it for dynamic insertion, but it still doesn't work. Libsyn is, totally anti-attribution. So we've got these different hosting companies that are not allowing for attribution tracking, and it is really hindering the ability for podcasters to monetize because they are not accepting the importance of attribution. When we look at attribution, I know that there's a privacy piece that is something to be considered, but I also think that it's important to look at what is happening in this space around privacy. I did a lot of research yesterday on some different attribution companies, and there are some emerging companies that are very focused on privacy, and I think it's important for us to consider that piece. We really do need the attribution model in order to see the results that these campaigns are producing. So I do believe that attribution is just going to continue to play a really significant role in the industry. Those are the predictions that I have. Hopefully, we're going to see really just an increase in ad sales like we have been seeing. I know that we have our site set on reaching that $1 billion mark this year, and I really do think that we're going to get there. So very exciting. I hope that I will see you at Podcast Movement in Nashville. I'm very excited to be there. So make sure that you do come and say hi to me. And thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Podcast Advertising Playbook. If you'd like more information about podcast advertising, please don't hesitate to come on over to our website at truenativemedia.com and fill out our contact form. Thanks so much. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you again soon.
If you want to learn more about how to be a market leader in podcast advertising, reach out to us at truenativemedia.com.